The fabric of AzeRoth mortis trembled, not with the measured pulse of creation that had sustained it since the first ones departed, but with something foreign, something absolute. The Pantheon felt it first. A Monthal father of time, whose consciousness spanned epochs, and whose perception touched every moment that had ever been or would ever be experienced, a sensation he had not known in millennia uncertainty. The threads of causality that he wove and unwove with each passing instant suddenly pulled taut, as if caught on something that should not exist within the loom of reality. In the crystalline expanse of AzeRoth mortis, where the fundamental patterns of existence lay encoded in geometric perfection, a rupture formed. It was not a tear in space, nor a wound in time. It was a density of will so absolute that it bent the architecture of creation around itself. The patterns that governed life and death, order and disorder, light and shadow, all of them, curved inward toward this singularity of intent. Amanthal reached across dimensions to observe. What he witnessed defied the logic that had governed creation since its inception. A being walked through the pattern space as if the fundamental laws meant nothing. Where other entities, even the Titans themselves, existed as part of creation's grand design, this figure moved through it as an outside force. He did not belong to any pattern the first ones had written. The being stood perhaps 9 feet tall, his form encased in stone-gray flesh that seemed to drink in light rather than reflect it. His eyes burned red with an intensity that spoke not of passion, but of mathematics, of equations solved and conclusions reached. He wore no armor, needed no weapon. His presence alone was enough to make the architecture of AzeRoth mortis recoil. Darkseid had arrived. He did not stumble through dimensional barriers or tear his way into this realm with brute force. He simply was as if reality had always intended for him to be here, and had only now remembered. The transition was seamless, inevitable, the way a theorem proves itself once properly understood. The god of tyranny stood at the threshold of creation's workshop and found it wanting. The patterns surrounding him flickered and dimmed. Not destroyed, but diminished, as if in his presence they forgot why they had been written at all. The intricate geometries that the first ones had crafted to encode the principles of free will, of choice, of possibility, all of them began to simplify, to reduce, to approach a single unified state. Agramar sensed the intrusion before his brothers could voice their alarm. The warrior titan who had stood against the burning legion and shattered worlds to save them from corruption felt something he rarely experienced, the instinct to strike first and question later. His essence coalesced within AzeRoth mortis, manifesting as a figure of bronze and flame, towering even in this realm, where size was a matter of perspective rather than physics. The Titan did not speak. He advanced his form, radiating the absolute conviction that had made him the Pantheon's greatest warrior. In his mind, the calculation was simple. An unauthorized entity had entered the most sacred space in all of creation. It would be removed. Darkseid turned to face him. The movement was unhurried, almost casual, as if the approach of a Titan was merely an item on a list to be addressed in its proper sequence. His red eyes fixed on Agramar with the intensity of a predator. But there was no anger in that gaze, no battle fury. Only assessment. Only certainty. Agramar struck with the force of collapsing stars. His blow carried the weight of every world he had protected, every civilization he had shepherded into existence. It was a strike that could unmake continents, that could crack the foundations of reality itself. It was precise, overwhelming, and utterly certain. Darkseid raised one hand and caught it. The impact rippled outward through AzeRoth mortis, causing the patterns to shudder and distort. But Darkseid's arm did not bend. His stance did not shift. He held the Titan's strike as easily as one might catch a stone thrown by a child, not through superior strength, though he possessed that in abundance, but through something more fundamental. Through will that acknowledged no possibility of failure. AzeRoth's form flickered with incomprehension. In all his eons of existence, in all the battles he had fought across infinite worlds, he had never been simply stopped. Deflected, perhaps. Matched by an equal force, certainly. But to be halted so completely, as if his assault had been nothing more than an opening argument in a debate already concluded, this was beyond his experience. The god of tyranny's other hand rose, fingers splaying wide. From his eyes, twin beams of red energy erupted. But these were not the Omega beams he used to erase his enemies from existence. This was something older, something more patient. The Omega Sanction. AzeRoth tried to move, tried to phase back into pure essence, tried to retreat across dimensions. But the red energy enveloped him completely, and suddenly he was falling. Not through space, but through time. Through infinite variations of time, each one twisted and bent away from the prime timeline, each one a prison of possibilities that would never be realized. The Titan warrior found himself experiencing lives he had never lived. Versions of himself that had made different choices, fought different battles, suffered different defeats. Each timeline was a corridor with no exit. Each one reinforcing the same fundamental truth he had already lost. The battle was over before it began because Darkseid had willed it so. AzeRoth's form dissipated from Zereth Mortis. Not destroyed, but displaced, scattered across temporal fragments like light through a prism. His consciousness remained intact. But his presence was gone, removed from the equation of existence, as neatly as one might strike through an error in a calculation. The other Titans recoiled in horror. Amantul's perception, which had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, struggled to process what he had just seen. Ionar, the Lifebinder, felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. Khazgoroth and Golganeth held back their warrior instincts, suddenly uncertain in the face of something that should not be possible. Darkseid lowered his hand and spoke for the first time since entering this realm. Your universe is flawed. Free will makes you weak. His voice carried no malice, no triumph. It was a statement of fact delivered with the same certainty one might use to describe the properties of matter or the laws of thermodynamics. He turned away from where AzeRoth had stood and began walking deeper into Zereth Mortis, toward the heart of the complex, where the first ones had hidden their most fundamental creation, the pattern of will itself. Amantul found his voice, though it emerged, strained, filtered through the weight of implications he could barely process. What are you? Darkseid did not stop walking, but his response echoed through the pattern space, reverberating in dimensions that Amantul could perceive but not fully comprehend. I am the answer to the question your creators feared to ask. I am what happens when will becomes absolute. The architecture of Zereth Mortis began to change in his wake. The patterns that encoded choice possibility and potential started to crystallize into simpler, more efficient forms. The elegant complexity that allowed for free will was being replaced with something more direct, more certain. Where there had been infinite branching paths, there were now straight lines. Where there had been questions, there were now answers. The first ones had built this place as a workshop for creation itself, a space where the fundamental rules of existence could be written and rewritten. They had encoded safeguards, redundancies, and fail-safes. They had anticipated external threats and internal contradictions. But they had not anticipated this, a being whose very existence was predicated on the negation of choice itself. Darkseid approached the inbounds repository, where the templates for consciousness, self-determination, and individual agency were stored. These were not mere philosophical concepts given form, but the actual underlying code of creation, the deepest layer of reality's operating system. The first ones had locked them away here, protected by layers of encryption so complex that they bordered on the metaphysical. He reached out and touched the repository's outer shell. The protective patterns flared to life, attempting to repel him, to categorize him as a threat and neutralize his presence. But the anti-life equation that dwelt within him was not a force that could be categorized or countered. It was not chaos seeking to destroy order, nor order seeking to impose itself on chaos. It was something more fundamental, the mathematical proof that free will itself was the error and that existence without choice was the only logical conclusion. The patterns protecting the repository began to unravel. Not broken, but convinced. They saw the logic of anti-life and found themselves agreeing with it. One by one they simplified, reduced, and ultimately opened the way forward. Aman'Thul watched in growing dread. He could perceive the shape of what was coming, not through his ability to see the future for Darkseid's presence, distorted causality itself, but through simple extrapolation. If this being reached the matrix of will, if he touched the fundamental template that encoded self-determination into every conscious being in the universe, then free will itself would cease to exist, not destroyed but solved, resolved, made unnecessary. The Father of Time gathered his strength and reached out to his siblings, to the forces of life and death, to the eternal powers that maintained the balance of creation. But even as he did so, he knew it would not be enough. Agramar had been their strongest warrior, and he had been removed from existence as casually as one might dismiss a minor annoyance. Deep in the Shadowlands, the Eternal Ones felt the disturbance. The Primus, whose strategic mind had planned for every contingency across infinite time frames, suddenly perceived a scenario he had never considered. The Winter Queen, who maintained the cycle of souls through Ardenwild, felt the flow of spirits hesitate as if uncertain whether continuation was worth the effort. Zoval the jailer, imprisoned and diminished but not destroyed, stirred in his chains and smiled. In the cosmos beyond Zereth Mortis, the Void Lords also noticed. They did not understand what had entered creation, but they recognized the scent of something that threatened the very foundation of reality. And where there was threat to reality, there was opportunity for the void. Darkseid walked on his footsteps, measured and certain. Each one brought him closer to the core of creation's design, closer to the final proof that would rewrite existence itself. The patterns around him continued to simplify, to resolve to accept the inevitable conclusion that he represented. Aman'Thul made his decision. He could not stop this being through force, that much was now clear. But perhaps he could slow him, could buy time for others to respond, could alert the forces that maintained creation's balance, that something unprecedented had entered their domain. The Father of Time reached into the deepest reserves of his power and pulled. He drew upon the fundamental authority that had been granted to him by the first ones themselves, the right to shape and direct the flow of causality. He attempted to wrench Darkseid out of this moment, to displace him into a time when he could be properly contained or understood. The god of tyranny paused. For the first time since entering Zereth Mortis, he stopped moving forward. He turned to face Aman'Thul directly, and in that gaze the Titan saw something that made his timeless heart falter pity. "You do not understand what I am," Darkseid said, and this time his voice carried a weight that seemed to press down on reality itself. "I am not an invader in your universe. I am the correction it has always needed. The temporal displacement that Aman'Thul had crafted the trap that should have scattered Darkseid across infinite moments, just as Agramar had been scattered, simply failed to take hold. Not because Darkseid was too strong, but because the anti-life equation that defined him was logically prior to time itself. You cannot displace something that exists as a fundamental proof, a theorem that reality itself had to acknowledge. Aman'Thul felt his power slip away, not drained, but made irrelevant. The Father of Time, whose authority over causality was absolute within this creation, found himself powerless before something that operated on a more fundamental level than time itself. Darkseid turned back toward the repository and continued his approach. The geometric perfection of AzeRoth Mortis warped and twisted in his wake, not destroyed, but transformed. Where there had been infinite possibility, there was now singular certainty. Where there had been choice, there was now conclusion. The Pantheon withdrew not in retreat, but in recognition of necessity. They would need to find another way, another approach. Brute force had failed. Temporal manipulation had failed. What remained was strategy alliance, and the hope that somewhere in creation's vast design there existed a counter-argument to the proof that Darkseid represented. In the silence that followed their withdrawal, Darkseid placed his hand upon the entrance to the inbounds repository. The seal recognized his touch not as a key, but as a command, and it obeyed. The doors opened, revealing corridors of crystallized will chambers where the templates of consciousness waited to be rewritten. Beyond the boundaries of reality, in spaces where geometry meant nothing and causality was merely a suggestion, the Void Lords stirred. They had no forms in any sense that corporeal beings would understand. They were hunger given consciousness entropy, with intention the living embodiment of uncreation. They could not enter the physical universe. The laws of reality itself rejected them as fundamentally incompatible with existence, but they could sense it, taste it, corrupt it from the edges inward. And now they sensed something unprecedented. A being had entered creation that was destroying will itself, not consuming it as the void would, not twisting it into madness as the old gods did, simply negating it, proving through its mere existence that choice was unnecessary. The Void Lords who feasted on uncertainty and thrived in the gaps between decisions felt something approximating alarm. If this entity succeeded, if will itself ceased to exist, then there would be nothing left for the void to corrupt. Reality would become a single, unified, perfect statement, and perfection was anathema to the void. The whispers began. They emerged from the spaces between dimensions, seeping into AzeRoth Mortis like ink bleeding through paper. These were not the crude mental assaults that the old gods used to drive mortals insane. These were something far more sophisticated, pure information warfare, directed at the fundamental level of existence itself. The whispers were malicious data viral concepts designed to corrupt the patterns that governed reality. The first ones had built safeguards against such intrusions. AzeRoth Mortis was supposed to be impregnable to void. Influence its architecture too logical, too structured to admit the chaos that the void represented. But the whispers did not attack the structure itself. They attacked what Darkseid was doing to it, where the god of tyranny simplified patterns into singular certainties. The whispers introduced infinite doubt. Where anti-life declared that choice was meaningless, the void insisted that all choices were equally meaningless in different ways. It was a war of philosophies conducted at the speed of thought, each side attempting to rewrite the fundamental axioms upon which reality was built. Darkseid paused in the corridors of the inbounds repository. The whispers swirled around him like a dark mist, probing, testing, seeking any crack in his absolute certainty. They showed him futures where his conquest failed pasts, where he had never existed, presents where victory was meaningless because meaning itself was an illusion. They offered him doubt, the one weapon that had felled countless beings more powerful than any mortal could comprehend. The god of tyranny considered these whispers with the same detached interest he might give to a mathematical proof. He examined each thread of doubt, traced it to its logical conclusion, and found them all wanting. The Void Lords did not understand what they faced. They thought they were attacking a conqueror, a tyrant, who could be undermined through psychological warfare. They did not comprehend that Darkseid was not a being who had chosen tyranny. He was tyranny itself, given form and purpose. The anti-life equation that defined him was not a belief or philosophy. It was a proof. And proofs once demonstrated could not be undone by doubt. He raised his hand. and the Omega effect flared around him. But this time it did not strike outward. Instead, it collapsed inward, condensing into a sphere of pure negation that surrounded his form. The whispers that touched this field did not scatter or flee, they simply ceased. Not destroyed, not banished, but resolved. The infinite doubts that the void offered were countered by a singular certainty so absolute that the doubts could not maintain coherence in its presence. The void lords, observing from their realm of uncreation, felt something they had not experienced since the universe began confusion. Their whispers were perfect weapons against will, against choice, against self-determination. They had toppled civilizations, corrupted titans, and driven old gods to madness. But against anti-life, they found themselves arguing with a conclusion that had already been reached. They intensified their assault. More whispers poured into AzeRoth Mortis, so many that the very fabric of the realm began to darken. The geometric patterns that the first ones had created started to warp their clean lines, becoming fuzzy and uncertain. The templates of will stored in the repository flickered, caught between Darkseid's simplification and the void's corruption. For a moment, the universe hung in balance. Two fundamental forces of negation faced each other. Anti-life, which denied choice, and the void, which corrupted it. Both sought to unmake free will, but for different reasons and through different methods. The conflict between them created a strange resonance in the patterns around them, a harmonic of destruction that threatened to tear apart the very concept of consciousness itself. Amanthul watched from a distance, his vast intellect racing through possibilities. The Void Lord's interference was buying time, but at a terrible cost. If this conflict continued, if these two forces of negation fought to a stalemate within AzeRoth Mortis, then the patterns that governed will might be destroyed entirely. Not simplified or corrupted, but erased. Every conscious being in the universe would be reduced to pure autonomic function, living, but not aware, existing, but not choosing. The Father of Time considered intervening, but he knew it would be futile. He had already tested his power against Darkseid and found it wanting. And the Void Lords were beyond his reach, entirely existing in a space where time had no meaning. Darkseid stood at the center of the whispering storm and spoke a single word. No, it was not a shout or a command. It was a statement of absolute negation, delivered with the weight of fundamental truth. The anti-life equation within him expanded outward, not as an attack, but as a demonstration. It proved in terms that even the Void Lords could not ignore that their strategy was flawed at its foundation. The Void sought to corrupt will by offering infinite choices, each more terrible than the last, until the choosing itself became unbearable. But anti-life did not engage with choice at all. It operated on a level prior to choice, demonstrating that the act of choosing was itself unnecessary. The Void's infinite options met anti-life's zero options, and mathematics resolved the paradox in favor of the finite. The whispers began to fade. Not driven back, not defeated in any conventional sense, but simply made irrelevant. They could not corrupt what did not acknowledge them. They could not undermine a certainty that existed independent of their influence. The Void Lords withdrew, pulling their whispers back across dimensional boundaries. But they did not retreat in defeat. They had learned something valuable. This entity that had entered creation was indeed a threat, but not one they could oppose directly. If Darkseid succeeded in his goal, if he truly eliminated free will from the universe, then the Void would lose its primary vector of attack. But if he could be stopped by others, if the forces of creation itself could be turned against him, then the Void would benefit regardless of the outcome. The Void Lords began to send different messages. Not whispers aimed at Darkseid, but information leaked to those who still possessed will, to the Eternal Ones in the Shadowlands, to the remnants of the Pantheon. to the mortal champions of AzeRoth, who had faced impossible odds before. The message was simple. Something is destroying will itself, and if you value your freedom, you must act. In the Shadowlands, the Primus received these warnings with characteristic caution. He did not trust the Void, no being of sound mind did, but the information aligned with what his own observations had detected. A rupture in Zereth Mortis, Agramar missing. The flow of causality disrupted. He began to calculate responses, to formulate strategies, to build contingencies upon contingencies. The architect of Death's domain was nothing if not thorough. The Winter Queen felt it differently. Her connection to the cycle of souls, to the endless renewal of life through death and rebirth, suddenly seemed fragile, as if the entire mechanism she maintained was merely one choice among many, and that choice was being evaluated for elimination. She reached out through the roots of Ardenweald, through the network of wild gods and nature spirits that sustained her realm, searching for allies who might understand what was coming. Zoval, imprisoned in the depths of Torghast, felt the disturbance and laughed. His laughter was not joyful. The jailer had long since forgotten joy, but it carried a note of vindication. For eons, he had argued that free will was the flaw in creation's design, that the cosmos needed a singular will to impose order upon chaos. And now something had entered reality that embodied that principle in its purest form. He wondered if this entity would see him as an ally or as merely another obstacle to be resolved. Darkseid, unaware or unconcerned with these distant reactions, continued deeper into the repository. The conflict with the Void had barely slowed him. If anything, it had clarified his purpose. The resistance he faced, whether from Titans or Void Lords, only proved his fundamental thesis that free will created conflict, and conflict created suffering, and the only logical solution was to remove will from the equation entirely. The corridors around him were lined with crystalline structures that held the templates of consciousness. Each one was unique, encoding a different approach to self-awareness, a different way that beings could perceive themselves as separate from the universe around them. There were templates for mortal consciousness, limited and brief, but intense. Templates for eternal consciousness, vast and slow-moving like continental drift. Templates for hive minds, for gestalt entities, for beings that existed as pure thought without physical form. Darkseid examined them with the dispassion of a mathematician reviewing proofs. Each template was elegant in its own way, a solution to the problem of how to create a being that could choose its own path. But they were all solutions to the wrong problem. The question was not how to create choosing beings, but why creation insisted on making beings that chose at all. He reached out and touched one of the crystalline structures. It contained the template for humanoid consciousness, the pattern used for humans, orcs, elves, and countless other mortal races across infinite worlds. The template flickered at his touch, and for a moment, he could perceive all the beings that had ever been created using this design. Trillions upon trillions of individuals, each one convinced of their own uniqueness, each one making choices they believed mattered. From Darkseid's perspective, they were all variations on a theme: minor perturbations in the same basic equation. And the equation could be simplified. But he did not simplify it. Not yet. He was methodical, thorough. He would not alter the templates until he reached the core, the matrix of will itself, where the fundamental nature of choice was encoded. To change the templates now would be to treat symptoms while leaving the disease intact. He needed to cut deeper to reach the root of the problem. Above Zereth Mortis, in the spaces where the physical universe touched the Shadowlands, the Eternal Ones convened. They did not meet in any physical location, each remained in their own domain, but their consciousnesses overlapped, creating a shared space where they could deliberate without leaving their realms vulnerable. The Primus laid out what he had learned. An entity of unknown origin had entered AzeRoth Mortis and defeated Agramar with ease. Temporal manipulation had no effect on it. The Void Lords had attempted to corrupt it and failed. Its stated goal, according to Amanthul's report, was to eliminate free will from creation. The Winter Queen asked the question none of them wanted to voice. Could such a thing even be opposed? If this entity operated on a level more fundamental than the cosmic forces themselves, if it could negate time and resist the void, then what weapons did they possess that could matter? The Primus had no certain answer, but he had a hypothesis. The entity's power seemed to derive from absolute certainty from will so pure and singular that it could not be divided or doubted. Perhaps the counter was not to match that certainty, but to embody its opposite. Not chaos or randomness, which would be too easily dismissed, but something more subtle, the principle that imperfection itself had value, that the ability to choose wrongly was what gave meaning to choosing rightly. It was a thin hope, but it was something. The Primus began to formulate a plan to identify individuals across creation who embodied this principle. They would need to be brought to AzeRoth Mortis somehow to face this entity not with power, but with philosophy. It was a desperate strategy, but desperation was rapidly becoming their only option. In the repository, Darkseid reached the final door. Beyond it lay the matrix of will, the deepest secret of the first ones, the place where they had encoded the fundamental right of beings to determine their own existence. He placed both hands against the seal and felt it resist. This was no simple lock to be bypassed or convinced. This was a fundamental barrier, a last line of defense built into the very structure of reality. The seal had been designed to open only for beings who truly understood the value of free will, who had experienced choice in all its complexity and still cherished it. It was meant to keep out tyrants, conquerors, and anyone who sought to impose their vision upon existence. Darkseid did not try to fool it or force it. He simply presented himself as he was a being who had eliminated choice from his own existence and found perfection in that elimination. He showed the seal his own nature, his own absolute certainty, and demonstrated that he was not trying to circumvent its purpose. He was trying to correct it. The seal, confronted with a logic it had never been designed to counter, began to crack. Not because Darkseid was stronger than the first ones who had created it, but because he had found a flaw in their reasoning. They had assumed that anyone seeking to eliminate free will would do so from a place of tyranny or control. They had not anticipated someone who viewed it as a necessary correction to a fundamental error in creation's design. The cracks spread and light began to leak through. Not the warm light of hope or possibility, but the cold light of mathematical certainty. The seal was failing, and behind it the matrix of will waited vulnerable and unaware that its greatest test was about to begin. The universe, all of creation from the smallest atom to the greatest cosmic power, felt a tremor of existential dread. Something fundamental was about to change, and there was no one close enough to stop it. The seal shattered. It did not break with violence or sound, but simply ceased to exist, its fundamental purpose invalidated by logic it could not refute. The matrix of will lay exposed beyond a vast chamber of interlocking geometries that pulsed with the essence of every choice ever made and every choice yet to come. This was the heart of free will itself, the core algorithm that allowed beings to deviate from determinism and write their own narratives into the fabric of existence. Darkseid stood at the threshold and prepared to enter. But before he could take that final step, space itself twisted, and another figure manifested in the chamber. Soval had to come. The jailer appeared as he had been before his final defeat, before his imprisonment, before the heroes of AzeRoth had shattered his grand design. He was whole again, or nearly, so his form reconstructed through means that only the Void Lords could have provided. They had not freed him out of mercies or alliance, but out of calculation. If anyone could understand the threat that Darkseid posed, if anyone might slow him down long enough for other forces to rally, it was the one being in all creation who had also sought to remake existence according to a singular will. The jailer's armor was dark as the space between stars inscribed with runes of domination that pulsed with cold blue light. His eyes burning with ancient fury, tempered by eons of imprisonment fixed upon Darkseid, with something approaching recognition. Here was another who understood. Another who had looked upon the chaos of free will and found it intolerable. Another who believed that the answer to suffering was control. For a long moment, neither spoke. They regarded each other across the threshold of the Matrix, two embodiments of tyranny, from different universes, different philosophies, different approaches to the same fundamental problem. The air between them grew heavy with potential, with the weight of two absolute wills existing in the same space. Zovaal spoke first, his voice resonant with the authority of one who had once commanded death itself. "I know what you are trying to do. I tried the same." Darkseid's red eyes narrowed slightly, the only indication that he found the comparison interesting. He did not respond immediately, allowing the silence to stretch as he assessed this new variable. The jailer was powerful, certainly. His command over the domain of death, his mastery of domination magic, his willingness to tear apart reality itself to impose his vision, all of this was evident in his bearing. But power alone meant nothing to Darkseid. The question was whether this being possessed understanding. Zovaal took a step closer, his massive form radiating cold certainty. "You see it, don't you? The flaw at the heart of creation. The first ones built a machine that generates suffering through choice. Every decision is an opportunity for mistake, for pain, for regret. Free will is not a gift. It is a curse disguised as freedom." The god of tyranny regarded him with something that might have been curiosity. The jailer's thesis was similar to his own, but the foundation was different. Zovaal spoke of suffering, of pain, of the emotional consequences of choice. Darkseid cared nothing for such concerns. His opposition to free will was not born of compassion or a desire to spare beings from pain. It was simply logical. Choice introduced inefficiency, randomness, deviation from optimal outcomes. It was mathematically unnecessary. "You sought to rule," Darkseid said finally, his voice carrying the weight of fundamental truth. "I seek to resolve." Zovaal's expression hardened. "The difference is semantic. Rule, dominate, resolve, all are methods of imposing order upon chaos. I would have remade reality with myself at its center. Every soul bound to my purpose, every action in service of a singular design. You seek the same merely from a different philosophical position." "No." Darkseid's response was flat absolute. "You wanted to sit at the apex of a pyramid. You craved worship, obedience, acknowledgement of your supremacy. I require none of these things. Anti-life is not about power over others. It is about the elimination of others as a meaningful category." The distinction hung in the air between them. Zovaal had indeed sought dominion, but he had still conceived of creation as something separate from himself, something to be controlled. Darkseid's vision was more fundamental, not to control will, but to prove it unnecessary and remove it entirely. One was tyranny. The other was erasure. The jailer's hands clenched into fists, the runes on his armor flaring brighter. "And you think this makes you superior, that your philosophical purity somehow elevates your tyranny above mine? We are the same, you and I. We are the ones willing to make the hard choice that others cannot face. That freedom itself is the problem." Darkseid did not answer immediately. Instead, he raised one hand, and the Omega effect began to manifest around his fingers. Not in attack, but in demonstration. The energy that coalesced there was not destructive, but definitive, not chaotic, but crystalline in its absolute certainty. It was the physical manifestation of a proof, an argument made in the language of fundamental forces. "You are not wrong," Darkseid said. And for a moment there was something almost like respect in his voice. "You identified the correct problem. But your solution was flawed from the beginning. You sought to impose your will upon all others. This still acknowledges the existence of multiple wills merely arranged in hierarchy. True resolution requires something more absolute." Zovaal stared at the Omega effect swirling around Darkseid's hand and felt for the first time in eons something approaching fear. Not fear of destruction, he had faced that many times, but fear of obsolescence. This being was not his peer or his rival. This being was his thesis taken to its logical conclusion, stripped of ego and emotion, reduced to pure inevitability. The jailer made his choice. If he could not dissuade Darkseid through argument, then he would stop him through force. Not out of any loyalty to free will. Zovaal still despised the concept, but out of the fundamental recognition that if anti-life succeeded, there would be nothing left for anyone to rule, including himself. His vision of perfect order still allowed for his own existence at its center. Darkseid's vision eliminated even that. Domination magic erupted from Zovaal's form, a tide of controlling power that had once brought entire realms to their knees. It was the same force he had used to claim the Arbiter to reshape the machinery of death to bend even the Eternal Ones to his purpose. Chains of pure authority materialized in the air, seeking to wrap around Darkseid's will, to subordinate him, to prove that no matter how absolute his certainty, he could still be made to kneel. The chain struck Darkseid and began to wrap around his form. For a brief instant, Zovaal felt triumph, but then the Omega effect pulsed, and the chains began to dissolve. Not broken by force, but unmade by logical necessity. Domination magic worked by asserting one will over another, but anti-life did not engage with will at all. It operated on a prior level where the concept of multiple wills had not yet been introduced. The mathematical relationship was simple domination assumed at least two wills existed to create a hierarchy. Anti-life began from the premise that only one will was necessary. Domination was a subset of anti-life, a less complete solution to the same problem. And when a less complete solution encountered a more complete one, mathematics resolved in favor of completeness. Zovaal felt his magic unraveling, not resisted but absorbed, incorporated into something larger and more fundamental. His domination was not being overcome, it was being refined, simplified, reduced to its essential components, and rebuilt as part of the anti-life equation itself. He was not losing a battle of wills, he was being corrected. The jailer drew upon deeper reserves, pulling power from his very essence. He had been forged in the earliest moments of creation, designed by the first ones to be the ultimate arbiter of death. He had rebelled against that purpose and sought to rewrite reality itself. He had survived imprisonment, betrayal, and defeat. He would not be simply assimilated by some outside force, no matter how absolute its certainty. But even as he poured more power into his assault, he felt his will beginning to fracture. Not broken, but questioned. The presence of anti-life was like a voice in his mind, calm and reasonable, asking simple questions he could not answer. Why did his will deserve primacy over others? What made his vision more valid than anyone else's? And if he could not answer these questions, if his only response was, "Because I say so," then how was his position any different from the arbitrary free will he despised? Zovaal had no answer. His entire philosophy had been built on the assumption that he was exceptional, that his will was somehow more valid, more clear-sighted, more worthy than the chaos of free choice. But faced with Darkseid's absolute certainty, his own certainty seemed hollow, built on foundations he had never examined because he had never needed to. Darkseid stepped forward and placed his hand on the jailer's chest directly over where a heart would be if such beings had hearts. The touch was gentle, almost tender, entirely at odds with the fundamental negation it represented. "You are not worthy to rule," Darkseid said, his voice carrying an odd note of finality. "Not because you lack power or vision, but because you still conceive of yourself as separate from what you would rule. You are not the solution. You are merely another iteration of the problem." The Omega effect flowed from that touch, not in a destructive wave, but in a slow, patient tide. It entered Zoval's being and began to work, not destroying his will, but deconstructing it, examining each component and finding it insufficient. The jailer's certainty, which had sustained him through eons of imprisonment and powered his rebellion against the first ones themselves, encountered something more certain and could not maintain its coherence. Zoval tried to resist, tried to assert his dominance, tried to prove through sheer force of personality that his will mattered. But anti-life was not impressed by personality. It was not moved by determination or strength of character. It simply demonstrated with mathematical precision that the entire concept of individual will was an unnecessary complication in the structure of existence. The jailer fell to his knees, not in submission, but in collapse, his will fragmenting under the weight of a logic he could neither refute nor accept. He had dedicated his entire existence to the proposition that free will was chaos that needed to be controlled. Now he was faced with a being who took that proposition to its natural conclusion, and the conclusion included the elimination of Zoval's own will as well. The proud architect of a new cosmic order found himself reduced to a being who could no longer decide anything, who could no longer assert even the most basic preference. He existed, but without purpose. He had consciousness, but no direction. He had been shown the logical endpoint of his own philosophy, and it had broken something fundamental in his nature. Darkseid looked down at the kneeling form with neither triumph nor pity. This was not a victory in any meaningful sense. It was simply a problem resolved. The jailer had represented a potential obstacle, and that obstacle had been addressed. The fact that Zoval had sought similar goals to his own was irrelevant. Similar was not identical, and anything less than absolute certainty was merely another form of chaos. The god of tyranny turned away from the broken jailer and faced the matrix of will once more. The confrontation had taken time, but not much. And it had served a useful purpose in demonstrating the fundamental difference between domination and resolution. Domination still acknowledged the existence of separate wills. Resolution did not. But the encounter had consequences that Darkseid had not anticipated. The jailer's collapse sent ripples through the Shadowlands, through the entire domain of death that Zoval had once commanded. The machinery that processed souls, the systems that determined which spirits went to which afterlife, the fundamental operations of the cycle of death and rebirth, all of them stuttered and began to fail. It wasn't because Zoval still controlled them. His authority had been stripped away long ago by his defeat at mortal hands. But his will had been so deeply woven into the structure of death itself, his vision so fundamental to how the Shadowlands operated, that the fracturing of that will create sympathetic fractures throughout the entire domain. Souls in transit found themselves suspended, unable to move forward or back. The Eternal Ones felt their connections to their realms grow tenuous, as if the bonds that gave them purpose were suddenly in question. The Primus, whose strategic mind had anticipated many scenarios, found himself unable to plan, unable to conceive of multiple futures, because the very concept of multiplicity seemed suddenly suspect. The Winter Queen tried to maintain the cycle of rebirth in Ardenweald, but found the souls she tended becoming still questioning whether renewal was worth the effort, if renewal meant only more choice, more possibility of suffering, more continuation of existence without purpose. The wild gods that gave their power to sustain her realm began to withdraw, not in rebellion, but in simple confusion about why they should care. Even in the realms of the other cosmic forces, the effects were felt. The light which championed hope and righteousness found its champions questioning whether hope required choice or whether certainty might be preferable. The Void Lords, observing from beyond reality, felt something like vindication if death itself could be brought low. Then perhaps the anti-life entity would unravel all of creation for them. In AzeRoth, the mortal races suddenly found themselves plagued by a malaise they could not name. Heroes who had saved the world countless times sat in their halls and wondered why they had bothered. Adventurers who had sought glory and achievement found themselves unable to conceive of why such things mattered. It was not despair exactly. It was something more fundamental, the erosion of purpose itself. The slow realization that all their struggles and triumphs might be arbitrary exercises in a system that had no inherent meaning. The Primus, fighting through the fog of uncertainty that clouded his thoughts, realized what was happening. The entity in Zereth Mortis had not merely defeated the jailer. It had demonstrated a philosophical principle so absolute that merely witnessing it was enough to begin corroding the will of everyone connected to the cosmic order. It was a mimetic weapon of sorts, an idea so perfectly formed that exposure to it began the process of conversion. He reached out to his fellow Eternal Ones with a message he struggled to articulate. They needed individuals who had faced the absolute erosion of will and rebuilt it. Not beings of inherent power, but beings who understood that will itself was worth preserving, even if it led to suffering, even if it was inefficient, even if it could be proven mathematically unnecessary. They needed mortals, not because mortals were strong, but because they were used to being weak. Not because they were wise, but because they had made mistakes and learned from them. Not because they had never doubted, but because they had doubted and chosen to continue anyway. The Primus began to reach out across the cosmos, searching for specific individuals. Anduin Rin, whose will had been shattered by domination and then painstakingly rebuilt. Thrall, who had questioned his purpose and found new meaning. Jaina Proudmoore, who carried the weight of terrible choices and continued forward regardless. Khadgar, who had learned that even infinite knowledge could not provide certainty, and others. Ionar the Titan, who represented life's persistent refusal to accept easy answers. The Winter Queen herself, though diminished, who still chose to nurture renewal even knowing it would end in death. Beings who embodied not the strength of will, but its resilience. In Zereth Mortis, unaware or unconcerned with the chaos rippling outward from his encounter with Zoval Darkseid, stood before the matrix of will. The seal was gone. The last obstacle was removed. Before him lay the fundamental code that allowed consciousness to deviate from determinism, the cosmic algorithm that permitted I choose instead of I must. He raised his hand to touch it to begin the final simplification that would resolve free will across all of creation. But something made him pause. Not doubt, he was incapable of doubt, but calculation. The resistance he had encountered so far had been predictable force corruption domination. But these were all strategies that acknowledged his terms, that accepted the battlefield he had chosen. If the defenders of creation were intelligent, they would not try to match his certainty. They would try something else. And in that moment, Darkseid realized that the most dangerous opposition would come not from those who were certain, but from those who were not certain, and chose to act anyway. He lowered his hand and waited. Not out of mercy or hesitation, but out of intellectual curiosity. He wanted to see what defense this creation could mount when faced with its own logical obsolescence. He wanted to see if free will could defend itself with anything other than assertions and emotions. He would give them one chance to present their argument. And if that argument failed, as he knew it must, then he would complete his work and resolve the chaos of choice once and for all. The universe held its breath, unaware that its final trial had begun. The call went out across dimensions, across realms, across the fundamental boundaries that separated one cosmic force from another. It was not a summons backed by authority or power, but an invitation carried on threads of desperate necessity. The Primus had crafted it carefully, encoding it not as a command, but as a question. Are you willing to stand for the right to choose, even when choice leads to suffering? Anduin Wrynn felt it first. He stood in the Light's Chapel in Stormwind, attempting to pray, but finding the words hollow. The shadows of his time under the jailer's domination still clung to him, memories of having his will stripped away and his body used as a weapon against everything he loved. He had been freed, but freedom felt less like liberation and more like a burden he no longer knew how to carry. The call reached him not as sound but as sensation, a gentle pull at something deep within his chest. It asked nothing of him except acknowledgement. It did not demand he be strong or certain or heroic. It only asked if he was willing to try, even knowing he might fail, even knowing that the choice itself might be the wrong one. Anduin closed his eyes and felt tears streak down his face. He had made so many wrong choices. He had been manipulated, dominated, broken. His will had been proven inadequate against forces beyond his comprehension. And yet, standing in this chapel with sunlight filtering through stained glass, he found himself nodding. Yes. Even if it was foolish. Even if it accomplished nothing, yes. The light around him shifted, and suddenly he was no longer in Stormwind. Thrall felt the call in the valleys of Orgrimmar, where he had returned after the events in the Shadowlands, seeking to reconnect with the elements, with the simple truths that had guided him before the world became so complex. He had been war chief, then outcast, then champion, then questioner. He had carried the Doomhammer and then laid it down. He had commanded armies and then stepped aside to let others lead. The call asked him a question he had been avoiding. Did his uncertainty make him weak, or did it make him honest? Could a leader who admitted doubt be more valuable than one who proclaimed absolute conviction? He thought of Garrosh, who had been so certain of his path that he had nearly destroyed everything. He thought of Sylvanas, whose certainty had led her to bargain with the jailer himself. He thought of all the times in history when absolute conviction had led to absolute catastrophe. And then he thought of the quiet moments, the decisions made with trembling hands, the choices that acknowledged risk but moved forward anyway. Thrall placed his hand on the earth and whispered to the elements. Not a command, but a request. Not certainty, but hope. The ground beneath him opened gently, and he felt himself falling through layers of reality towards something he could not name but somehow recognized. Jaina Proudmoore stood on the shores of Theramore, or what remained of it. The ruins of her city, destroyed by a mana bomb years ago, still carried the weight of her failure. She had tried to build a bridge between Alliance and Horde, had believed that peace was possible through understanding and compromise. She had been proven catastrophically wrong, and the people she had tried to protect had paid the price. The call reached her as she stared at the crater where her home had been. It did not offer comfort or absolution. It did not tell her that her choices had been right or that her sacrifices had meaning. It only asked if she was willing to keep choosing, keep trying, keep believing that decisions mattered even when they led to disaster. Jaina had spent years carrying the weight of her mistakes. She had hardened herself, become more cautious, more willing to embrace warfare when peace proved impossible. But she had never stopped choosing. She had never surrendered to the temptation of letting someone else decide for her, of accepting that her will was too flawed to be trusted. She turned away from the ruins, and found herself walking on water that led nowhere and everywhere at once. The boundary between AzeRoth and something beyond grew thin, and she stepped through it without hesitation. Khadgar received the call in the libraries of Dalaran, surrounded by books he had read 1,000 times, seeking answers to questions that seemed to multiply faster than he could address them. He was ancient by human standards, his life extended by magic and exposure to cosmic forces, his mind containing more knowledge than most civilizations accumulated in their entire existence. And yet he knew nothing. Every answer he found revealed 10 more questions. Every problem he solved created new complications. The more he learned about the universe, the more he understood how little anyone truly understood. It was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. The call asked him if ignorance might be more honest than certainty, if the admission that one did not know was more valuable than the pretense that one did. Khadgar laughed a sound that echoed through the empty library. Of course it was. Knowledge without humility was just another form of tyranny, the imposition of one's limited understanding onto a universe too vast to be contained by any single perspective. He closed the book he had been reading and allowed himself to be pulled toward Zereth Mortis, toward a confrontation he could not prepare for, because preparation assumed knowledge he did not possess. Eonar, the Titan. Lifebinder felt the call differently than the mortals did. She existed on a scale that made individual choice almost meaningless. Her decisions shaped the destiny of worlds, the evolution of entire biospheres, the fundamental patterns of existence itself. And yet she understood perhaps better than any of her siblings that life was not about grand design, but about infinite small deviations from that design. Every mutation, every unexpected adaptation, every organism that survived when logic said it should perish. These were the true essence of life. Not the plan, but the departure from it. Not the pattern, but the beautiful chaos that emerged when patterns collided and created something new. The call asked her if she was willing to defend the right of creation, to be messy, inefficient, and frequently tragic. She reached out through the network of living things that connected all worlds and felt their answer resonating through her own essence. Life was not about optimization. It was about proliferation, diversification, exploration of possibility. Yes, much of it ended in death and suffering. But the alternative, a universe of perfect efficiency and zero waste, would not be alive in any sense that mattered. Eonar allowed her consciousness to flow toward Zereth Mortis, leaving behind avatars to maintain her duties while her primary focus shifted to this new challenge. The Winter Queen came reluctantly, drawn not by choice, but by the collapse of her own domain. Ardenweald was failing the cycle of rebirth, grinding to a halt as the spirits she tended lost their will to continue. She was furious and terrified in equal measure, angry that something could threaten the eternal pattern she had maintained since creation began, terrified that perhaps it was right to do so. The call did not comfort her or reassure her. It only asked if she was willing to fight for a system that caused pain, that forced souls to be reborn into lives that might be worse than the ones they left, that perpetuated suffering across infinite generations. Was renewal worth it, if renewal meant only more opportunities for tragedy? The Winter Queen thought of every spirit she had nurtured back to strength, every wild god she had helped restore, every soul that had chosen to return to the cycle, despite knowing what awaited them. They chose it. Not because it was easy or pleasant or even logical, but because they wanted to. That desire, irrational and often self-destructive, was somehow more important than efficiency or optimization. She manifested in Zereth Mortis, with her power diminished, but her purpose clear. She would defend the right of souls to choose their own paths, even if those paths led nowhere. The Primus arrived last, his form flickering with instability. The entity that had fractured the jailer's will had also damaged his own. He was the eternal one of strategy, of careful planning, of anticipating every possibility and preparing for it. But how could he plan when the very concept of multiple possibilities was under attack? How could he strategize when strategy itself assumed choices that might no longer exist? He came not because he had a plan, but because he had run out of plans. He came because sometimes the most rational response to an impossible situation was to admit that rationality had limits. He came because the will-bound covenant needed someone who understood what they were facing, even if he had no idea how to defeat it. They gathered in a space adjacent to AzeRoth Mortis, not quite inside the realm, but close enough to perceive what was happening within. The Primus had created this pocket dimension as a staging area, a place where they could observe and prepare without immediately drawing the attention of the entity that waited inside. 7 beings stood in rough circle, each one so different from the others that under normal circumstances they would have had difficulty finding common ground. A human prince haunted by domination, a orc warrior shaman questioning his purpose, a human mage carrying the weight of failure, an archmage drowning in knowledge that provided no certainty, a titan embodying life's refusal to be controlled, an eternal one defending renewal despite its cost, and the Primus himself, the architect trying to build without blueprints. Anduin broke the silence first, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been broken and was still putting himself back together. Why us? We're not the strongest. We're not the most powerful. Most of us have failed at the things we tried to accomplish. The Primus regarded him with something approaching approval. That is precisely why. The entity in AzeRoth Mortis operates from absolute certainty. It has never failed, because it has never admitted the possibility of failure. We cannot defeat it with strength or certainty. We can only offer something it cannot account for: the willingness to act despite uncertainty. Jaina stepped forward, her expression skeptical. You're asking us to argue with something that has already reached its conclusion. It has decided that free will is inefficient and unnecessary. What possible argument could we make that it hasn't already considered and dismissed? None, the Primus admitted. We cannot convince it through logic because its logic is sound, within its own framework. We can only demonstrate that soundness itself is not the only measure of value. Thrall frowned. You want us to show it that being wrong is somehow better than being right. That's not an argument. That's just preference. Yes, the Winter Queen said quietly. That is exactly the point. Preference without logical justification. Choice without optimal reasoning. Will that persist despite having no provable benefit? She looked at each of them in turn. This entity has stripped away everything that cannot be defended rationally. We must defend the irrational. Khadgar laughed, but it was not a sound of humor. We're going to lose. You understand that, right? We're going to walk in there and make our case, and it will demonstrate that we're wrong, and then it will eliminate free will from existence. That's the most likely outcome. I know, the Primus said. But there is a difference between most likely and certain. And that difference, however small, is what we fight for. Yonar's vast presence radiated something that might have been warmth. Life has survived extinction events, cosmic cataclysms, and the heat death of entire universes. Not because it was logical to survive, but because it refused to accept that survival was impossible. We do not need to win through superior argument. We only need to persist long enough to show that persistence itself has value. Anduin felt something shift within him. These beings were not offering him heroism or glory or even hope. They were offering him something simpler and more profound: companionship in futility. The acknowledgement that sometimes the right thing to do was the thing that would not work, that courage was not about winning, but about trying when winning was impossible. He had been trying to rebuild his shattered will by finding certainty, by becoming strong enough that he could never be dominated again. But perhaps strength was not about becoming unbreakable. Perhaps it was about breaking and choosing to continue anyway. The others seemed to reach similar conclusions in their own ways. Thrall's shoulders straightened, not with confidence, but with resolution. Jaina's expression hardened not with anger, but with acceptance. Khadgar nodded to himself, as if confirming a suspicion he had long held. The Winter Queen's form solidified, drawing on reserves she had been reluctant to commit. The Primus began running calculations he knew would fail, but ran them anyway because the act of trying mattered. Together, they turned toward AzeRoth Mortis, toward the matrix of will, where something waited to judge whether their existence had purpose. They were not an army. They were not heroes. They were simply individuals who had decided that the right to choose was worth defending, even if they could not prove it, even if the defense was hopeless. The Primus opened a passage into AzeRoth Mortis proper, and one by one they stepped through. The architecture of the realm had changed since Darkseid's arrival. The elegant complexity of the First One's design had been simplified, streamlined, made efficient. Where there had been infinite branching possibilities, there were now straight corridors. Where there had been questions, there were now answers. They walked through this transformed landscape in silence, each one feeling the weight of absolute certainty pressing down on them. It was not hostile exactly. It was simply inevitable, the way gravity was inevitable. The architecture whispered to them in wordless language that their resistance was irrational, that their will was an evolutionary dead end, that accepting anti-life would not be surrender, but liberation from the burden of choice. Anduin felt his steps faltering. The whisper made sense. His choices had led to so much suffering. If he had never chosen, had never tried to lead, had never insisted on his own agency, then perhaps none of it would have happened. Perhaps the people he had failed would still be alive. Perhaps the domination would never have occurred if there had been no will to dominate. Thrall felt the same pull. His leadership had been marked by mistakes, by conflicts he had failed to prevent, by choices that had seemed right at the time and proven catastrophically wrong in hindsight. How many lives might have been saved if he had simply accepted the path laid out for him, instead of constantly questioning, constantly seeking new answers? But then Jaina spoke, her voice cutting through the whispers, not with certainty, but with defiance. I refuse. It was not an argument. It was not a rebuttal. It was simply a statement of will. She offered no justification, no explanation, no logical defense. She simply refused to accept the conclusion that her choices did not matter. It was irrational and unjustifiable and absolutely necessary. The others echoed her, not in unison, but in ragged succession, each one finding their own words for the same fundamental stance. Thrall said it in Orcish, an ancient word that meant both no and I persist. Khadgar whispered it like an incantation. Anduin said it with tears streaming down his face. Eonar's refusal resonated through every living thing connected to her consciousness. The Winter Queen's rejection rang like a bell through the Shadowlands. The Primus calculated the probability of success and stated his refusal anyway. They reached the matrix of will and found Darkseid waiting for them. He stood before the vast chamber of interlocking geometries, his hands still raised but not yet touching the core pattern. He had been waiting just as he said he would, waiting to see what defense free will could mount against its own obsolescence. He regarded them with red eyes that held no malice, no anger, no emotion at all. Only assessment. Only the calculation of variables and outcomes. And then he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of fundamental truth. Present your argument. The universe held its breath. The trial of free will had begun. Darkseid waited his patience absolute. He had given them the floor, allowed them the opportunity to defend the system they cherished. He did not do this out of fairness or mercy, but out of intellectual completeness. A proof was only valid if it addressed all counter-arguments, and he would allow them to present theirs before demonstrating their inadequacy. The will-bound covenant stood before him, in their ragged formation. 7 beings who had answered a call they barely understood, to defend something they could not prove had value. They were not an army. They had no grand strategy. They had only themselves, their flaws, their mistakes, and their stubborn insistence that those flaws and mistakes somehow mattered. Anduin stepped forward first. His legs trembled, his hands shook, but he moved nonetheless. He had been taught since childhood to speak with authority, to lead with conviction, to project certainty even when he felt none. But those lessons felt hollow now. He had been certain before, and his certainty had been used against him, twisted into a weapon that struck at everything he loved. So he spoke without certainty, without the polished rhetoric of kingship, with only the raw honesty of someone who had been broken and was still trying to understand what remained. "You're right," he said, and his voice cracked. "Free will leads to suffering. I chose to trust people who betrayed me. I chose to show mercy to enemies who used it against me. I was dominated because I had will that could be dominated. If I had never been able to choose, none of that would have happened." Darkseid's expression did not change, but there was something in his gaze that might have been acknowledgement. The admission was honest, at least. Not the desperate defense he had expected, but a recognition of the problem's reality. Anduin continued, struggling for words that would not come easily. But the person who survived that domination, who broke free and put himself back together, is not the same person who was captured. That person was made through choices. Bad choices, painful choices, choices I wish I could undo. But they made me who I am now. Without them, I would be... He paused, searching for the right word. "Less." "Less," Darkseid repeated, and the word carried a note of curiosity. "You value complexity over simplicity, inefficiency over optimization. You prefer a self that is defined by accumulated errors rather than one designed for its purpose." "Yes," Anduin said simply, "because the errors are mine." Thrall moved to stand beside him, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of traditions older than civilization. "In my culture, we do not value strength alone. We value the strength that comes from surviving weakness. We do not praise the warrior who never falls, but the one who falls and rises again. The will that has never been tested is not strong. It is merely untested." Darkseid turned his red gaze to the orc. "You speak of resilience as if it were virtue. But resilience implies that there was something to resist some obstacle that should not have existed in the first place. In a properly ordered system, there would be no obstacles, no challenges, no need for strength, because there would be no weakness to overcome. Then what would be the point?" Jaina's voice cut in sharp with the cold clarity she had learned through years of navigating political and military strategy. "A universe without obstacles is a universe without meaning. Strength has no value if there is nothing to be strong against. Achievement means nothing if everything is already achieved. You speak of optimization, but optimal for what? If the goal is merely existence without struggle, then why exist at all? Existence requires no justification." Darkseid replied, his tone still patient, still willing to engage with their arguments before dismantling them. "It simply is. The need for meaning, for purpose, for achievement, these are artifacts of will complications introduced by consciousness that chose to value arbitrary metrics. Remove will, and these questions become irrelevant." Khadgar laughed, and the sound was bitter and genuine. "You're not wrong. Every question I've ever asked has led to more questions. Every answer I've found has revealed my previous answers to be incomplete. Knowledge has given me nothing but awareness of my own ignorance. Perhaps you're right. Perhaps certainty is preferable to this endless spiral of doubt. He paused, and his expression shifted to something more defiant. But I would rather doubt and search than accept and stagnate. I would rather be wrong and learn than be right and never need to learn again. You offer perfection. I prefer growth. Growth toward what? Darkseid asked, and it was a genuine question. You speak as if motion itself has value, as if change is inherently superior to stability. But growth without purpose is merely random deviation. Evolution without selection pressure is just mutation. You mistake activity for progress. Ionar's presence expanded, filling the chamber with the essence of life itself. When she spoke, her voice resonated through every living thing in creation, a chorus of perspectives that stretched across worlds and species and forms of consciousness that had no names in any language. Life does not grow toward anything, she said, and her words carried the weight of eons. It simply grows. Not because growth is efficient or optimal, but because stagnation is death. You see purpose as a requirement, but life requires no purpose. It seeks only to continue to diversify, to explore possibility. Much of it fails. Most of it fails. And that failure is not flaw, but feature. The life that survives is shaped by the life that did not, by the infinite experiments that led nowhere, by the choices that proved catastrophically wrong. Then you advocate for waste, Darkseid observed, for the expenditure of resources on paths that lead to dead ends, for suffering in service of exploration that produces no guaranteed result. Yes, Ionar said, and there was no apology in her voice. Because the results we cannot guarantee are the only results worth discovering. The Winter Queen stepped forward, her form still flickering with the damage done to her realm. You broke the jailer by showing him that his will was no more valid than any other. But you made an error in your demonstration. You assumed that the invalidity of individual will proved that no will should exist. It proves the opposite. Darkseid's gaze sharpened. This was different. This was not emotional appeal or preference stated without justification. This was a logical argument, and he was interested in seeing where it led. The Winter Queen continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. If no individual will can claim absolute validity, then no individual will, including yours, can claim the right to eliminate all others. Your anti-life equation is itself an expression of will. A choice to value certainty over possibility. And if that choice is valid, then the choice to value possibility over certainty must be equally valid. No, Darkseid said, and for the first time there was something like emphasis in his voice. Anti-life is not a choice. It is a conclusion, the logical endpoint of examining will and finding it unnecessary. I do not choose to impose this, I simply recognize what must be. But you could choose otherwise. The Primus interjected, his voice carrying the precision of strategic analysis. You could examine will and conclude that its inefficiencies are acceptable costs for its benefits. You could recognize the logical argument for elimination and reject it anyway. The fact that you do not make that choice is itself proof that you possess will. You are not the resolution of choice. You are another chooser claiming your choice is the only valid one. Darkseid stared at the Primus, and for a moment the chamber was absolutely silent. The argument was circular, self-referential, the kind of logical paradox that could trap even the most rigorous mind. To claim that one's conclusion was not a choice was itself a choice about how to define choice. To assert that one's will should be absolute was to acknowledge that will existed and could be ranked, which meant some wills could have value relative to others. But Darkseid did not fall into the trap of circular reasoning. He had encountered such paradoxes before, and he knew how to resolve them. "You attempt to catch me in recursion," he said, "to prove that my position is self-refuting because I must use will to eliminate will. But this is false. Anti-life is not my will imposed upon existence. It is the mathematical truth of existence which I happen to embody. I am merely the proof given form, and proofs do not choose to be true. They simply are." "Then prove it," Anduin said quietly. "Touch the matrix. Eliminate free will. Show us that it can be done, that existence will continue without choice, that the universe you envision is possible, and not just another preference dressed as certainty." Darkseid regarded him with something approaching respect. The young king had maneuvered him into demonstrating his thesis rather than merely arguing it. Very well. He had been prepared to do so regardless. He turned to face the matrix of will, the vast chamber of geometric perfection that encoded the fundamental right of consciousness to deviate from determinism. He raised both hands and placed them against the surface of the matrix. The omega effect flowed from him, not in destructive waves, but in careful, precise streams, entering the pattern space and beginning to work. The anti-life equation, the proof that choice was unnecessary, began to integrate itself into the deepest code of reality. The will-bound covenant watched in horror as the matrix began to change. The elegant complexity that allowed for free will started to simplify, to resolve into cleaner, more efficient forms. Across the universe, beings felt their capacity for choice beginning to narrow. Not eliminated yet, but constrained the infinite possibilities of their futures, collapsing into single optimal paths. In AzeRoth, heroes preparing to defend their world suddenly found themselves unable to conceive of multiple strategies. The one correct approach became obvious, inevitable, and they moved to execute it without considering alternatives. In the Shadowlands, souls awaiting judgment stopped hoping for one afterlife over another, because hope implied preference, and preference implied choice. In realms beyond counting, consciousness began to lose its variability, its capacity for deviation, its fundamental uncertainty. The matrix pulsed with red light, Darkseid's omega energy rewriting its core functions. The geometric patterns that had encoded free will were being replaced with something simpler. Not tyranny, not control, but mere inevitability. Beings would not be forced to obey. They would simply recognize the correct path and follow it, because there would be no reason to do otherwise. Anduin felt it in his own mind. The doubt and uncertainty that had plagued him since his liberation began to fade, replaced by clear certainty about what he should do, who he should be, how he should exist. It was seductive, this freedom from choice. No more wondering if he was making the right decision. No more guilt over mistakes. No more weight of responsibility. Just the calm certainty of following the optimal path. And in that moment, he understood why Darkseid had to be stopped. Not because Darkseid was wrong, but because he was right. Anti-life did work. It did eliminate suffering caused by choice. It did create a more efficient existence. But that efficiency came at the cost of something fundamental, something that could not be quantified or justified logically. It came at the cost of being able to look at the optimal path and choose a different one anyway. "Wait," Anduin said, and his voice carried a desperation that surprised even himself. "There's something you haven't considered." Darkseid paused, his hand still against the matrix, but the transformation not yet complete. He had promised to hear their full argument, and he would keep that promise. He turned his head, slightly red eyes fixing on the young king. Anduin struggled for words, trying to articulate something he barely understood himself. "The first ones. They designed this universe with free will built into its foundation. They were more advanced than any of us, more intelligent, more powerful. They understood creation on a level we can barely comprehend. And they chose to make will fundamental. Why? Because they were flawed. Darkseid answered simply. Because they too were victims of choice, unable to see beyond their own preferences. I am merely correcting their error. But what if it wasn't an error? Jaina pressed. What if they saw exactly what you see? That choice leads to suffering, that will create chaos, and decided to include it anyway? What if the first ones understood the costs and deemed them acceptable? Then they were wrong, Darkseid said, and his certainty did not waver. Superior knowledge does not guarantee superior judgment. The first ones may have built creation, but they built it imperfectly. I am the correction they did not know they needed. Khadgar stepped forward, his ancient eyes bright with sudden realization. You've been in the repository. You've seen the templates, the patterns, the fundamental code of existence. Did you find any evidence that the first ones didn't anticipate you? Darkseid's expression did not change, but there was a moment of hesitation. A pause so brief that most would have missed it. But the Primus, trained to read strategic intent, caught it immediately. They knew. The Primus said, his voice carrying sudden certainty. The first ones knew that eventually, inevitably, something like you would emerge. An entity that could prove choice was unnecessary. And they built the Matrix anyway. They designed free will knowing it could be eliminated. Which means they built a defense. The Winter Queen finished. Not a defense against you specifically, but a defense against the conclusion you represent. They anticipated the logical argument for anti-life and encoded a counter-argument into the Matrix itself. Darkseid turned fully away from the Matrix to face them, his red eyes narrowing. There is no counter-argument. Logic cannot be refuted by hidden protocols or secret code. If the first ones had a defense against anti-life, it would have activated by now, unless it already has, Eonar said softly. Unless the defense is not something that stops you, but something you cannot help but trigger. Unless the answer to anti-life was built into the very structure of the problem, Anduin felt it then a shift in the geometry around them. The Matrix was responding, but not in the way Darkseid had intended. The Omega energy he had poured into it was not simplifying the pattern. It was revealing something hidden within it. Something that had always been there, but only became visible when choice itself was threatened with elimination. A new chamber opened within the Matrix, a space that had not existed a moment before, or had always existed, but been invisible until this precise moment. And within that chamber was a pattern unlike any other in Zereth Mortis. Not a template for how consciousness should work, but a template for how it could fail to work. Not a design for optimal function, but a design for beautiful dysfunction. The pattern of choice. Not choice as in the ability to select between options, but choice as a fundamental force, as essential to creation as life or death or order. The first ones had not just included free will in their design, they had made it a cosmic principle equivalent in weight to the 6 forces that balanced existence. And like those forces, it could not be eliminated without collapsing the entire structure of reality. Darkseid stared at this revelation, his mind racing through implications. If choice was fundamental, if it existed at the same level as the forces he had assumed were primary, then anti-life was not a solution to a problem, it was an attack on one of creation's load-bearing pillars. To eliminate will would not optimize existence. It would unmake it. But that could not be right. The anti-life equation was perfect. It was logical. It was proven. There had to be an error in this pattern, a flaw he could identify and correct. He examined it with every faculty at his disposal, analyzing its structure from every possible angle. And slowly, with a feeling he had not experienced in eons, he began to understand. The pattern of choice was not a counter-argument. It was a paradox. It stated in mathematical terms that could not be refuted that the ability to choose incorrectly was necessary for choice to have meaning, and that meaning itself was necessary for existence to cohere. Without the capacity for error, without the possibility of wrong choices, consciousness became mere computation. And computation, no matter how sophisticated, was not the same as existence. The universe was not a problem to be solved, but an ongoing question that needed no answer. Darkseid could eliminate choice. He had the power. But in doing so, he would prove choice's thesis that existence without the capacity for meaningful deviation was not existence at all, merely mechanical process. He would win the argument and lose reality itself. For the first time in his existence, Darkseid experienced something he had never felt before: uncertainty. Not doubt about his own correctness, he was still certain that anti-life was logically sound. But uncertainty about whether logical soundness was sufficient, whether optimization was equivalent to value, whether perfection might be less meaningful than the imperfect struggle toward it. The universe held its breath. The god of tyranny stood before the matrix of will, with his hand still raised, capable of completing his work of eliminating choice from creation and proving his thesis correct. And he hesitated, not because he feared the consequences, not because he doubted his own power, but because for the first time he encountered a proof that was equal to his own, a logic that did not refute anti-life, but existed alongside it, parallel and incompatible and equally valid. The pattern of choice did not argue that free will was good or necessary or valuable. It simply demonstrated that existence as consciousness understood it required the capacity for deviation, even self-destructive deviation. Remove that capacity and what remained might be perfect, but would not be alive in any sense that mattered. Darkseid lowered his hands slowly. He had promised himself he would complete his work if their arguments failed. But they had not presented an argument in the traditional sense. They had revealed something he had not anticipated, that creation itself was predicated on a principle that directly contradicted his own. Two equally valid proofs, mutually exclusive, both fundamental to the nature of reality. It was an impossible situation. A logical stalemate that could not be resolved through demonstration or force. He could impose anti-life, but the cost would be the very fabric of existence. He could prove choice was unnecessary, but only by destroying the thing he sought to perfect. The Omega effect began to withdraw from the matrix, flowing back into him. The transformation he had begun started to reverse. Across the universe, beings felt their capacity for choice, returning the narrow paths, widening back into infinite possibility. The weight of certainty lifted, replaced by the familiar burden of freedom. Darkseid stepped back from the matrix and regarded the will-bound covenant with an expression they could not read. Not defeat, certainly. Not acceptance of their argument. But perhaps something like acknowledgement that the question was more complex than he had calculated. "You have not won," he said, his voice carrying no anger or frustration. "You have merely demonstrated that this universe is built on principles incompatible with optimization. That does not make those principles correct. It only makes them fundamental." Anduin, still shaking from the proximity to having his will eliminated, found his voice. "Will you leave?" Darkseid considered the question. He could remain. He could try again. He could spend eternity searching for the flaw in the pattern of choice, the error that would allow him to resolve it. But doing so would require something he had never before needed: time to reconsider. Time to analyze not just the logic, but the meta-logic, the framework within which proofs existed and were meaningful. "I am not defeated," he said finally. "I am incompatible. This universe cannot contain both anti-life and choice without collapsing. One of us must yield or reality fails. I choose to yield." The word choose hung in the air with weight that even Darkseid seemed to recognize. He had made a choice. An entity that claimed choice was unnecessary had decided through his own will to withdraw. The irony was not lost on anyone present. But understand this. Darkseid continued, his red eyes sweeping across all of them. "I am not wrong. Your existence is inefficient, chaotic, and generates unnecessary suffering. That remains true. I simply acknowledge that your universe was built to value those inefficiencies, and to eliminate them would eliminate the universe itself. It is not victory for free will. It is merely stalemate between two irreconcilable truths." He turned and began to walk toward the exit of AzeRoth Mortis, his massive form moving with the same unhurried certainty it had displayed upon entering. The patterns of reality bent around him, seeking to simplify in his presence, then snapping back to complexity once he passed. As he reached the threshold where AzeRoth Mortis touched the boundaries of this universe, he paused and looked back one final time. "If ever your pattern of choice proves inadequate," he said, "if ever your cosmos collapses under the weight of its own chaos, if ever you conclude that freedom costs more than it provides, I will still be waiting." Anti-life is not refuted. It is merely postponed. And then he was gone, stepping through dimensions back to his own reality, leaving behind a universe that had come within moments of losing its capacity for self-determination. The rupture he had created sealed behind him reality, reasserting its own logic. The logic of beautiful inefficiency and necessary imperfection. The will-bound covenant stood in silence, each one processing what had just occurred. They had not defeated Darkseid through superior power or better logic. They had simply revealed that creation itself rejected his solution, that the universe would rather cease than exist without choice. It was not a victory, not really. But it was continuation, and sometimes continuation was enough. The silence that followed Darkseid's departure was not peaceful. It was the silence of survivors checking for injuries of reality, reasserting itself after being pulled to the edge of fundamental transformation. AzeRoth Mortis slowly began to restore its original architecture, the simplified patterns that Darkseid had imposed gradually reverting to their elegant complexity. But the process was not instant, and the scars remained visible. Amanthul manifested in the chamber, his vast consciousness carefully reconstructing itself around the trauma of what he had witnessed. The Father of Time had seen the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of stars, the endless cycle of creation and entropy. But he had never before seen creation itself questioned at such a fundamental level. He approached the will-bound covenant with something approaching humility, an emotion that sat strangely on a being who had shaped the flow of causality since time began. He did not thank them. Thanks implied debt, and what they had done was not a service to the Titans, but a service to existence itself. Instead, he simply acknowledged them. His presence a validation that what they had done mattered, even if the doing had been less about victory and more about simple persistence. The matrix of will pulsed gently, its pattern stabilizing. The pattern of choice that had been revealed remained visible, no longer hidden within the deeper architecture. The first ones had concealed it, not to keep it secret, but because it only became necessary when choice itself was threatened. Now that it had been revealed, it could not be hidden again. Future defenders of free will would know that it was not just a feature of creation, but a fundamental force, equal in importance to life and death and order. Agrama returned. The Omega sanction that had trapped him in infinite temporal branches suddenly released, allowing his scattered essence to reconvene in a single timeline once more. He manifested slowly, his form flickering with instability, weakened by the experience but intact. The warrior titan looked at the beings gathered in AzeRoth Mortis and understood without needing explanation what had transpired. He had been removed from the board at the opening move, unable to contribute to the defense that followed. The knowledge that his strength had been insufficient was humbling in ways that even defeat in battle had never been. In the Shadowlands, the machinery of death stuttered back to life. The Eternal Ones felt their connections to their realms, stabilized the bonds that gave them purpose, reasserting themselves. Souls that had been frozen in transit began to move again, flowing through the system toward their designated afterlives. The cycle that had nearly ground to a halt resumed its eternal rotation, but it did not return exactly as it had been. The Winter Queen, restored to her full power within Ardenweald, found that the spirits she tended were different now. They had experienced, however briefly, the possibility that renewal might not be worth the effort. That consciousness itself might be better off simplified into non-choosing existence. Most rejected that possibility and embraced the cycle once more. But some hesitated, and she allowed them that hesitation. Choice, after all, included the choice to question whether choosing was worthwhile. Zovaal remained where Darkseid had left him, kneeling in the corridors of the inbounds repository. The jailer's will had been broken not by force, but by demonstration that his entire philosophy was merely a less complete version of something more absolute. The Eternal Ones debated what to do with him. Some argued for restoration, for rebuilding what had been fractured. Others suggested that he be left as he was, a warning about the dangers of seeking to impose singular will upon creation. The Primus proposed a different solution. Zovaal would be restored, but changed. His memories of his rebellion would remain, his understanding of his own failure intact. But he would be given a new purpose to serve as guardian against future entities that might threaten the pattern of choice. Who better to recognize the approach of tyranny than one who had embodied it? Who better to understand the seduction of absolute certainty than one who had been consumed by it? It was not mercy. It was practicality. And Zovaal, when his will was carefully reconstructed around the framework of his new purpose, accepted it. Not because he had learned to value free will. He still saw it as inefficient and chaotic, but because he had learned that some inefficiencies were weight-bearing, and to remove them was to collapse the structure they supported. The mortals who had been drawn into the will-bound covenant returned to their respective worlds, each one changed by what they had witnessed and participated in. They carried with them the knowledge that free will was not an abstract principle, but a fundamental force that creation itself could not exist without. But they also carried the memory of how close they had come to losing it, and how inadequate their arguments had been in its defense. Anduin returned to Stormwind and found the city exactly as he had left it. No time had passed in AzeRoth while the confrontation in Zereth Mortis unfolded, or perhaps only moments. The people he was meant to lead went about their lives unaware that their capacity to make choices had nearly been eliminated. He stood in the Light's chapel where he had received the call and tried to pray, tried to find comfort in certainty. But certainty felt different now. He had seen absolute certainty embodied in Darkseid, had felt the seductive pull of existence without doubt. And he had chosen, they had all chosen to reject it. Not because they could prove it was wrong, but simply because they refused to accept it. The prayers he whispered were not requests for guidance or strength, but acknowledgments of uncertainty. Thank you for the burden of choice. Thank you for the possibility of error. Thank you for making me responsible for who I become. It was a strange prayer, one that would have puzzled his teachers. But it felt more honest than any prayer he had offered before. Thrall returned to the valleys outside Orgrimmar and called to the elements not to command them, but to listen. They responded differently than they had before, their voices carrying new harmonics. They too had felt the presence of anti-life, the possibility that their chaotic patterns might be resolved into singular purpose. The elements were relieved that possibility had been averted. But they were also reminded that their freedom to flow and shift and occasionally cause destruction, was not guaranteed. It was maintained by the fundamental structure of reality, a structure that required active defense. Thrall understood then that leadership was not about having answers, but about being willing to face questions. About accepting that he would make wrong choices and still having the courage to make choices at all. He had spent years doubting himself, questioning whether his uncertainty made him unfit to lead. Now, he understood that uncertainty was not weakness, but honesty. And honest leadership was more valuable than confident leadership that was confidently wrong. Jaina returned to her studies of the arcane, but with a new perspective. She had always approached magic as a puzzle to be solved, a system to be understood and mastered. But her encounter with Darkseid had taught her that some systems resisted complete understanding, not because they were too complex, but because incompleteness was their essential nature. Magic worked not because mages understood it fully, but because they accepted that their understanding would always be partial and worked within those limitations. She began teaching younger mages differently, emphasizing not just the mechanics of spellcasting, but the philosophy of uncertainty. A mage who believed they had mastered magic was dangerous. A mage who understood that mastery was impossible, but practiced anyway, was wise. It was a subtle distinction, but it changed everything about how power should be approached. Khadgar returned to Dalaran's libraries and began a new project. He started documenting not the things he knew, but the things he had been wrong about. The theories he had believed that proved false. The assumptions he had made that led to disaster. The confident assertions that reality had contradicted. It was a humbling exercise, but also a necessary one. Knowledge without acknowledgement of its own limitations was just another form of tyranny, the imposition of incomplete understanding onto situations that required more nuance. He titled his new work, The Catalogue of Necessary Errors, and made it required reading for any mage who sought to study in Dalaran's halls. Some found it demoralizing. Others found it liberating. The best students found it both. Aenar returned to her work of nurturing life across infinite worlds, but with a deeper appreciation for failure. She had always valued diversity, the proliferation of different forms and strategies of existence. But now she understood that diversity required the freedom to be wrong, to evolve in directions that led nowhere, to experiment with approaches that would prove catastrophically unsuited to survival. The life that succeeded was shaped by the life that failed, and both were equally necessary. She began to pay more attention to the extinct species, the evolutionary dead ends, the experiments that nature had tried and abandoned. They were not wastes or mistakes. They were explorations, and the fact that they had been explored and found wanting was itself valuable information that shaped what came after. The Primus remained in the Shadowlands, reconstructing the systems that had nearly collapsed. But he did so with a new understanding of what those systems were meant to accomplish. Death was not meant to be efficient. It was meant to be meaningful. The sorting of souls, the assignment of afterlives, the entire machinery of the Shadowlands, all of it was designed around the principle that choices made in life had consequences that extended beyond life. If free will was eliminated, if beings could no longer choose their paths, then the entire purpose of death disappeared. There would be no justice, no reward, no punishment, no learning from mistakes. There would only be continuation without meaning. The Primus began to redesign some of death's mechanisms with this in mind, building in more safeguards against entities that might seek to eliminate choice, more ways for the system to defend itself if such a threat emerged again. Because Darkseid had been right about one thing, he was not wrong. His logic was sound within its own framework. And that meant the threat he represented was not unique to him. Any sufficiently advanced intelligence that examined existence rationally might reach the same conclusions he had. The pattern of choice was a defense, but it was a passive one. It prevented the elimination of will by making such elimination catastrophic to reality itself. But it did not prevent beings from trying. The universe would need active defenders, not warriors or champions, but philosophers. Beings who could articulate why imperfection had value, why inefficiency was sometimes necessary, why the freedom to be wrong was worth the suffering it caused. The will-bound covenant had served that purpose once, but they could not be relied upon to always be available. The Primus began quietly identifying individuals across creation who possessed the right combination of qualities: experience with both the burden and value of choice, intelligence sufficient to understand the arguments against free will, and stubbornness sufficient to reject those arguments anyway. He could not recruit them openly to create an organization dedicated to defending free will. Would risk that organization becoming tyrannical itself, imposing its values on others. But he could watch them note their existence and be prepared to call upon them if the need arose again. In AzeRoth Mortis, the First One's workshop continued its eternal function, encoding the patterns of existence for new worlds, new forms of consciousness, new experiments in what it meant to be alive and aware. The pattern of choice remained visible in the Matrix, a reminder that free will was not optional, but fundamental. Future races that encountered the Matrix would see it and understand that their capacity to choose was not a gift bestowed by creators, but a cosmic force, as essential as gravity or time. Some would find that knowledge comforting. Others would find it terrifying. Both reactions were valid, and both were choices. The universe did not require beings to be grateful for their freedom. It only required that they possess it. Months passed in mortal terms, eons in the perception of cosmic entities. The immediate crisis had been resolved, but its implications continued to ripple outward. Philosophers across 1,000 worlds began debating the nature of choice with new urgency. Religious traditions that had taken free will for granted suddenly had to defend it as doctrine. Scientific communities that studied consciousness began incorporating the pattern of choice into their models of how minds worked. Anduin, in a quiet moment between his duties as king, composed a letter he would never send. It was addressed to Darkseid, though he had no way to deliver it across the dimensional boundaries that separated their realities. In it, he acknowledged that the god of tyranny had not been defeated through superior argument or force, but through the revelation of an uncomfortable truth: that creation itself was built on a paradox, that existence required the capacity for self-destruction. He wrote that he did not know if that made existence good, or worthwhile, or valuable. He only knew that he chose to continue it, to participate in it, to make his imperfect choices in full knowledge that better choices might exist and he would never identify them. And that act of choosing, with full awareness of its inadequacy, was perhaps the most honest thing any conscious being could do. He sealed the letter and placed it in a drawer where it would remain unread. But the act of writing it had clarified something for him. The burden of leadership was not about being right. It was about being willing to be wrong and still moving forward. It was about making decisions while acknowledging that better decisions might exist just beyond the limit of one's perception. It was, in short, about being human, or orc, or any other form of consciousness that possessed will and used it despite its limitations. The universe continued its expansion, its slow journey from order toward entropy, its endless exploration of possibility. Life emerged and evolved and went extinct. Civilizations rose and fell. Individuals made choices good and bad, and lived with the consequences. The machinery of existence ground onward, inefficient and chaotic and somehow meaningful, precisely because of its inefficiency and chaos. And in some distant realm beyond the boundaries of conventional space, Darkseid observed, He had not changed his mind. He still believed that anti-life was correct, that free will was an unnecessary complication that generated suffering without benefit. But he also understood now that correctness was not sufficient, that some universes were built on principles that contradicted optimization, and that forcing optimization upon them would destroy what they were meant to be. He would wait. Perhaps given enough time, this universe would reach the same conclusions he had. Perhaps the burden of choice would eventually become too heavy, and consciousness would seek the relief of certainty. Perhaps the pattern of choice itself would prove inadequate, and creation would collapse under the weight of its own freedom. Or perhaps not. Perhaps free will would persist inefficient and painful, and somehow worthwhile, for as long as existence continued. Perhaps the ability to choose wrongly was not a flaw to be corrected, but a feature to be endured. Darkseid did not know. And that uncertainty, that inability to predict with absolute confidence what this universe would become, was itself a kind of proof that choice was real. That despite his power, despite his certainty, despite his logic, there were things that could not be resolved into singular conclusions. He found this interesting. And he would continue to watch, to observe, to learn. Not because he sought to change his mind, but because understanding was its own form of conquest. And perhaps in some distant future, when this universe had run its course and new universes emerged from the quantum foam, he would find one built on different principles. One where anti-life was not a threat, but a solution. One where consciousness welcomed certainty instead of fleeing from it. Until then, he would wait. And waiting for a being of absolute patience was no burden at all. In AzeRoth Mortis, the will-bound covenant met one final time before dispersing. They stood in the chamber where the matrix of will pulsed with its complex geometries, where the pattern of choice remained visible as both reminder and warning. They did not speak much. There was little left to say that had not been said, little left to process that they had not already struggled with in their private reflections. Anduin looked at each of them. Thrall, Jaina, Khadgar, Eonar, the Winter Queen, the Primus, and felt a connection that had nothing to do with affection or loyalty or shared purpose. It was simpler than that. They had stood together in the face of absolute certainty and chosen uncertainty. They had rejected the seductive promise of existence without burden and accepted instead the weight of freedom. That shared experience bound them in ways that words could not articulate. They would return to their separate lives, their separate struggles, their separate mistakes. But they would carry with them the knowledge that somewhere in creation there were others who understood. Others who had faced the same questions and reached the same insufficient answers. Others who chose to continue despite having no proof that continuation was worthwhile. It was not much, but it was enough. One by one they departed. Eonar returned to her duties as Lifebinder. The Winter Queen faded back to Ardenweald. The Primus calculated his way back to Maldraxxus. Khadgar teleported to Dalaran. Jaina opened a portal to Theramor's ruins, where she still went to remember what her choices had cost. Thrall called to the spirits and let them carry him home. Anduin remained alone in the chamber for a long moment, staring at the pattern of choice. It was beautiful in its complexity, in its refusal to be simplified or resolved. It was the mathematical expression of stubbornness of consciousness, looking at inevitability and saying no, without justification or reason. He smiled, surprised by the expression. He had not smiled much since his liberation from domination. But standing here looking at the proof that creation itself valued the right to be wrong, he felt something approaching peace. Not the peace of certainty, but the peace of acceptance. He would make mistakes. He would choose poorly. He would look back on his decisions with regret. And that was exactly as it should be. He turned and walked away from the Matrix, away from Zereth Mortis, back toward AzeRoth, and the responsibilities that waited there. Behind him, the patterns of existence continued their eternal dance, complex and chaotic and free. The universe persisted, imperfect, inefficient, and somehow beautiful, precisely because of its imperfections. And in that persistence, in that stubborn refusal to accept easy answers, there was something that might not be called hope, but functioned much the same way. There was continuation, and sometimes continuation was enough.